The courtroom was silent, thick with tension. The air smelled of polished wood, fresh ink, and something else, something more primal. Anticipation. The case that had brought national attention to this Florida courthouse was about to begin. On one side of the courtroom stood PAM Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, known for her fierce rhetoric and unwavering stance on immigration enforcement. On the other side, Julian Vega, a fiery liberal activist and civil rights lawyer, who had made his name defending undocumented immigrants caught in the legal crossfire of shifting policies. The case wasn't just about one man. It was about thousands. PAM Bondi's side represented the state of Florida in its lawsuit against the city of Miami, arguing that its so-called sanctuary policies directly defied state and federal immigration law. Julian Vega was representing a coalition of immigrants' rights organizations and, more specifically, one man, Mateo Castillo, a Honduran construction worker who had lived in Miami for over 10 years without documentation. He had been arrested for a minor traffic violation and was now facing deportation, despite being a father of 2 American-born children. "Your Honor," Bondi's voice rang out, confident, measured. She stepped toward the bench, a picture of control in her Navy power suit, her blonde hair in a tight, immaculate ponytail. The state of Florida is not only within its rights but has an obligation to enforce immigration laws as dictated by federal statutes. When cities create these so-called sanctuary protections, they undermine public safety, drain state resources, and send a message that the law can be ignored at will. Vega, sitting at the defendant's table, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His dark eyes studied her as she spoke, looking for an opening, a weakness in her argument. His signature blue tie, emblazoned with the image of a broken chain, stood out against his crisp white shirt. "Ms. Bondi," Judge Horowitz said, adjusting his glasses, "are you arguing that Miami's policies violate Florida's anti-sanctuary law?" "Yes, Your Honor." She turned, sweeping the room with a hard stare. "Local officials have deliberately obstructed immigration and customs enforcement, ICE, operations by refusing to detain undocumented individuals like Mr. Castillo. We have evidence that Miami police were ordered to release him rather than comply with the ICE detainer. That's a direct violation of Florida law." Vega finally stood, buttoning his suit jacket. His movements were smooth, practiced. "With all due respect, Your Honor, what Ms. Bondi conveniently fails to mention is that Miami's so-called sanctuary policies are not about defying the law. They are about protecting families, ensuring that undocumented people are not afraid to report crimes, and preventing the unconstitutional overreach of immigration enforcement." Bondi's jaw tightened. The press had already dubbed Vega the immigrant's defender, and he was living up to the role, painting her as the villain. Vega continued, his voice rising just enough to capture the jury's full attention. "Mateo Castillo is a hard-working man, a father, a taxpayer. He has no criminal record. And yet, because of a broken tail light, because of a technicality, the state of Florida wants to rip him away from his children and send him back to a country he barely knows anymore." He turned to face the jury directly, his expression softening. "That is not justice. That is cruelty masquerading as law and order." A murmur rippled through the audience. Bondi knew she had to strike fast before sentiment overtook logic. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. "We cannot make decisions based on emotions alone, Your Honor," she said, her tone cooling to the sharpness of a blade. "The law is clear. Mr. Castillo has no legal right to remain in this country. If Miami's policies were truly about protecting families, why do we see an increase in crime in sanctuary cities? Why are criminal aliens allowed to walk free because of these policies?" Vega turned sharply. "Objection. Criminal aliens is a loaded term." "Sustained," the judge said, giving Bondi a sharp look. "Ms. Bondi, let's keep the language neutral." She didn't flinch. She had expected that. But she knew how to frame a case, and Vega had just given her an opening. "I'll rephrase," she said smoothly. "The point remains. Policies that shield undocumented individuals from deportation ultimately put law-abiding citizens at risk." Vega shook his head, feigning exasperation. "You say law-abiding, Ms. Bondi, but let's talk about the facts. Immigrants, documented or not, commit fewer crimes than native-born citizens. Miami's policies don't make the city more dangerous. They make it safer. People like Mateo Castillo are less likely to engage in crime because they have too much to lose. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Vega, the issue at hand is not whether Miami's policies are moral, but whether they violate state law. Stay focused. Vega took a slow breath, then nodded. Understood, Your Honor. My point remains. Florida's anti-sanctuary law is in direct conflict with Miami's constitutional right to govern itself. The state is overreaching. Bondi seized the moment. And yet, Your Honor, the Constitution clearly states that immigration is a federal issue, and states have the right to enforce federal immigration laws. Miami cannot pick and choose which laws to follow. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Bondi could see members of the jury shifting in their seats, absorbing every word. The press in the back row scribbled furiously. The judge turned to both attorneys. We will recess for lunch. When we return, I expect arguments to stay rooted in legal precedent. Bondi and Vega locked eyes as they gathered their notes. This was far from over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed both sides, cameras flashing. Ms. Bondi, critics say your position is heartless. How do you respond? She smiled tightly. Following the law isn't heartless, it's justice. Nearby, Vega turned to another reporter. This case isn't just about one man. It's about what kind of country we want to be. Inside the courthouse, the battle lines had been drawn. When they returned from recess, things were only going to get bloodier. The courtroom reconvened after lunch, but the energy had shifted. Outside, the press swarmed like sharks, reporters shouting questions, while inside, the jury filed in with a new sense of alertness. Word had spread, this wasn't just another policy debate. This was a battle of ideologies. PAM Bondi stood at the prosecution's table, her posture unwavering. Julian Vega was across from her, his hands folded in front of him, exuding the cool confidence of a man who knew how to turn a courtroom into a stage. Judge Horowitz adjusted his glasses and sighed. Let's get back to business. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent decades watching people try to bend the law to their advantage. Ms. Bondi, you may continue. Pam stepped forward, keeping her voice even and deliberate. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that Miami's sanctuary policies have directly obstructed law enforcement and endangered public safety. She turned and nodded toward her assistant, who handed her a thick file. She held it up for the jury to see. These are documented cases where ICE detainers were ignored. Individuals arrested for violent crimes were released back onto the streets, individuals who should have been deported. And yet, because of policies like the one that kept Mr. Castillo in Miami, these criminals remained here and reoffended. Vega didn't flinch. He leaned against his table, fingers steepled. He knew what she was doing, pushing the emotional buttons of the jury before he could. Bondi continued. Here's just one example. She opened the file. 2 years ago, Luis Mendez, an undocumented immigrant with multiple prior arrests, was released due to a sanctuary city policy. A week later, he was charged with armed robbery. If ICE had been allowed to do its job, that crime never would have happened. She turned, locking eyes with the jury. This is not an isolated incident. Vega exhaled, finally stepping forward. Objection, Your Honor. We're discussing one case, Mr. Castillo's case, not a broad attack on all undocumented immigrants. Judge Horowitz rubbed his temples. Sustained. Keep it relevant, Ms. Bondi. She nodded, but the damage was done. She had planted the seed. Sanctuary policies had consequences. Vega walked to the center of the courtroom, adjusting his cufflinks. Ms. Bondi just painted a picture for you, he said, his voice smooth and controlled. A picture meant to make you afraid. He turned, hands in his pockets. But let's talk about reality, shall we? He gestured toward the defense table, where Mateo Castillo sat, his face pale, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. This man is not a violent criminal, Vega continued. He is a father. He works construction. He pays taxes. He has never been arrested for anything other than this traffic stop. And yet, because of laws like the one Ms. Bondi is defending, his children, who are U.S. citizens, may lose their father. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Bondi stepped forward. The law doesn't make exceptions based on sympathy, Mr. Vega. Vega turned, eyes flashing. And that's the problem, Ms. Bondi. The law you're defending sees no difference between a hard-working father and a criminal. It treats them both as illegal. Bondi tilted her head slightly. Because they are both illegal. The room went still. Vega took a slow breath. Tell me, Ms. Bondi, do you believe every law is inherently just? She narrowed her eyes, sensing a trap. That's not the question at hand. Vega smiled. Oh, but it is. Because if we followed every law without question, there would be no civil rights, no women's suffrage, no protections for the very people who built this country. Bondi folded her arms. Are you seriously comparing enforcing immigration laws to Jim Crow? History will decide that, Vega said. But here's what I can tell you. Deporting Mateo Castillo doesn't make Florida safer. It doesn't make America stronger. It simply makes 2 children fatherless. For the first time, Bondi hesitated. Vega saw it and pressed forward. Now, let's talk about the Constitution. He walked toward the judge's bench. The 10th Amendment gives states the right to govern themselves. Miami's decision not to comply with ICE detainers is not illegal, it's autonomy. Bondi recovered quickly. It's obstruction, Your Honor. Judge Horowitz sighed. Let's get back on track. Mr. Vega, do you have further evidence to present? Vega nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I call to the stand Mateo Castillo. A ripple of movement swept the room as Mateo slowly stood. The bailiff escorted him to the witness chair, where he took an oath and sat down, his hands trembling slightly. Vega approached him, softening his voice. Mr. Castillo, he began, how long have you lived in the United States? Mateo cleared his throat. 10 years. And why did you come here? Mateo shifted in his seat, his voice quiet. For my family. There was nothing for us in Honduras. I wanted a better life for my children. Vega nodded. And do you have a criminal record? No, Mateo said firmly. Never. Vega turned to Bondi. A dangerous man, wouldn't you agree, Ms. Bondi? She didn't react. She knew Vega was building his narrative. He turned back to Mateo. What will happen if you're deported? Mateo's throat worked as he swallowed. My children, they won't have anyone. Their mother died last year. If I go, they'll end up in foster care. The silence was deafening. Vega turned to the jury. This man broke no violent laws. He contributes to society. And yet, Ms. Bondi would have you believe that deporting him is justice. Bondi straightened. She had to take control. Mr. Castillo, she said, stepping forward, do you believe that the United States has the right to enforce its borders? Mateo hesitated. Yes, but... Bondi pounced. Then you admit that you knowingly broke the law? Vega objected. Your Honor, my client is not on trial for a crime. Judge Horowitz held up a hand. Sustained. Bondi sighed. No further questions. As Mateo left the stand, the jury's expressions were unreadable. Vega turned back to Bondi. You say this is about the law. I say it's about humanity. Bondi shook her head. Then maybe you should be running a charity instead of practicing law. Vega smirked. And maybe you should be running for office instead of pretending to care about the Constitution. The judge banged his gavel. Enough. Court is adjourned until tomorrow. As the room emptied, Bondi and Vega locked eyes. The battle wasn't over. And when they returned, neither was holding back. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with restless energy. Reporters huddled outside, their cameras poised, waiting for the latest battle between Pam Bondi and Julian Vega. The case had become a national spectacle, and the stakes were higher than ever. Inside, the jury filed in, their expressions carefully neutral. Vega adjusted his tie, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. Across from him, Bondi sat stone-faced, her legal pad filled with notes, her strategy carefully mapped out. Today, she wasn't just defending the law, she was on the attack. The gavel struck. Judge Horowitz barely looked up. Mr. Vega, You may continue. Vega rose smoothly. Thank you, Your Honor. He turned to the jury. Yesterday, we heard from Mateo Castillo, a man who has lived here for 10 years, a man whose only crime was existing in a system that offers no path forward for people like him. We heard about his children, about the life he built here. He paced slowly, letting his words settle. And yet, the state of Florida believes deporting him is necessary. That justice demands it. That tearing a father away from his children makes this country safer. He turned sharply toward Bondi. But Ms. Bondi, let's talk about who actually benefits from deportations, shall we? Bondi's eyes narrowed. She didn't like the direction this was going. Vega turned to the courtroom screen. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit B into evidence. The bailiff carried over a thick folder. The screen flickered to life, revealing a slide with the words Private Detention Contracts in bold red letters. Vega's voice hardened. We talk about immigration enforcement like it's about the law. But the truth is, there's big money in deportations. He clicked to the next slide, showing a series of financial records. Private detention facilities are raking in billions from ICE contracts. And do you know how they make their money? By keeping beds full. The more deportations, the higher the profits. He turned to Bondi. Ms. Bondi, do you deny that Florida has contracts with for-profit detention centers? She sat forward. Of course we do. ICE requires space to house individuals pending removal. That's how the system works. Vega's lips curled into a smirk. Ah, the system. A system where private companies profit off broken families. Where taxpayer dollars are funneled into corporations that need deportations to stay in business. Bondi's voice remained steady. Mr. Vega is using scare tactics. The state of Florida does not control federal detention policies. We are simply upholding the law. Vega's expression darkened. No, Ms. Bondi. You're upholding a business model. Murmurs rippled through the jury. Bondi stood, straightening her jacket. Your Honor, I would remind Mr. Vega that we are not here to discuss federal contracts. We are here to determine if Miami's sanctuary policies violate state law. Judge Horowitz nodded. Stay on topic, Mr. Vega. Vega turned back to the jury. Of course, Your Honor. His voice softened, but the fire in his eyes remained. I'm not asking you to ignore the law. I'm asking you to see the bigger picture. If we keep pretending that immigration is a simple issue of law and order, we ignore the fact that entire industries are built on keeping people like Mateo Castillo in the crosshairs. He turned back to his table. No further questions. Judge Horowitz sighed. Ms. Bondi, your witness. Bondi wasted no time. She strode toward the center of the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Let's talk about laws, shall we? She said, her tone measured. Mr. Vega, your argument is compelling, but you've conveniently ignored one thing. Mateo Castillo entered this country illegally. He knew the risks. She turned to the jury, voice firm. We can debate ethics all day, but at the end of the day, our nation has borders. And borders mean something. Laws mean something. And when we selectively enforce those laws, we invite chaos. Vega leaned back in his chair, watching. Waiting. Bondi continued. Mr. Vega wants to paint this as a battle between heartless law enforcement and innocent families. But here's the truth. If we stop enforcing immigration laws, if we allow cities like Miami to ignore ICE detainers, we are telling the world that America's borders don't matter. And that is not just dangerous, it's unconstitutional. She turned sharply toward Vega. Tell me, Mr. Vega, do you believe in border enforcement? Vega met her gaze without hesitation. I believe in fair enforcement. I believe in a system that doesn't punish people for simply trying to survive. Bondi nodded, as if expecting that answer. And who decides what's fair? You. Local governments. At what point do we stop being a nation of laws and start being a nation of exceptions? The courtroom was silent. Vega finally spoke, his voice calm. We stop when the law serves justice, not blind punishment. Bondi shook her head. Justice is following the law, Mr. Vega. Anything else is chaos. Judge Horowitz cleared his throat. Let's keep moving. Ms. Bondi, do you have any witnesses to call? She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The state of Florida calls ICE Director James Kessler to the stand. A tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair stood and walked to the witness chair. He was the image of authority, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. Bondi wasted no time. Director Kessler, can you tell us what happens when local jurisdictions refuse to comply with ICE detainers? Kessler folded his hands. It makes our job significantly harder. When cities ignore detainers, dangerous individuals can disappear into communities before we have the chance to remove them. Bondi nodded. And would you say that Miami's policies have made your job more difficult? Kessler exhaled. Absolutely. She turned to the jury. There you have it. These policies actively prevent law enforcement from doing their job. Vega stood. Cross-examination, Your Honor? Horowitz nodded. Proceed. Vega approached Kessler, hands in his pockets. Director Kessler, how many violent criminals were released due to Miami's sanctuary policies last year? Kessler hesitated. I don't have an exact number. Vega raised an eyebrow. Ballpark it. Kessler shifted slightly. A small percentage. Vega pounced. So, for clarification, the vast majority of people detained by ICE are not violent criminals? Kessler frowned. That's not what I said. Vega turned to the jury. But it is the truth. He stepped closer. Mr. Castillo is not a criminal. He is a father. And yet, the system wants to treat him like one. He let the words hang in the air. No further questions. Judge Horowitz sighed. We'll adjourn for the day. Closing arguments will begin tomorrow. The courtroom erupted in whispers. As Bondi gathered her notes, Vega leaned over. Tomorrow, he murmured, you're going to lose. Bondi smirked. We'll see about that. The final day of the trial had arrived. The courtroom was packed, the tension crackling like a live wire. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens poised, their cameras waiting for the final showdown between Pam Bondi and Julian Vega. Pam sat at the prosecution's table, her expression unreadable. She was no stranger to high-stakes battles, but she knew this one would be close. Julian Vega, her opponent, sat across from her, calm but sharp-eyed, his confidence unwavering. Judge Horowitz entered, his robes billowing as he took his seat. He gave a tired sigh before turning to the attorneys. Are both sides ready for closing arguments? Bondi stood first. Yes, Your Honor. Vega nodded. Ready. The judge gestured for Bondi to proceed. She rose with practiced precision, walking slowly to the jury, her heels clicking with each step. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, this case isn't about emotions. It's about the law. She folded her hands in front of her. We can sympathize with Mr. Castillo. We can feel for his children. But at the end of the day, we cannot allow sympathy to override the rule of law. She turned, meeting the jurors' eyes one by one. The moment we start making exceptions, the moment we say, well, this case is different, this man deserves to stay even though he broke the law, we open the floodgates. Her voice grew firmer. Miami's sanctuary policies set a dangerous precedent. If local governments can ignore immigration laws, what stops them from ignoring other laws? What happens when a city decides it doesn't want to enforce drug laws? Or theft? Or fraud? She took a slow step forward. This is about order. This is about fairness. And fairness means applying the law equally to everyone. She turned slightly, glancing at Vega. My opponent wants you to believe that enforcing immigration law is cruel. But what is truly cruel is telling legal immigrants, people who waited, who followed the rules, who sacrificed, that their patience meant nothing. She gestured toward the jury. If we don't enforce our laws, then laws are meaningless. She paused, letting the words settle. That is why I ask you to rule in favor of the state of Florida. Because the law is not a suggestion. It is a promise. A promise that this country will not descend into lawlessness. With that, she returned to her seat, her face calm, her argument airtight. The courtroom was silent as Vega slowly rose. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his tie as he approached the jury. His expression was measured, but there was an unmistakable fire in his eyes. "Ms. Bondi is right about one thing," he said. "This is about the law." He clasped his hands behind his back, nodding slightly as he spoke. "But laws are not infallible. Laws are made by people. And sometimes, people get it wrong." He let the words sink in before continuing. "History is filled with examples of unjust laws. Segregation was legal. Denying women the right to vote was legal. Internment camps for Japanese Americans were legal. But that didn't make them right." He turned slightly, pacing with slow deliberation. "If the law is broken, we change it. And if the law is cruel, we must change it." He stopped, facing the jury directly. "Ms. Bondi wants you to believe that this is about order. That following the law, no matter the cost, is justice. But let me ask you this: does justice tear families apart? Does justice punish a man who has done nothing but work hard and care for his children?" He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Justice is not blind obedience. Justice is doing what is right." He turned, pointing toward Mateo Castillo, who sat silently, his hands clenched together. "This man, this father, is not a threat. He is not a criminal. And yet, because of a broken tail light, the state of Florida wants to send him away from his children. They want to rip apart a family because they can." He exhaled, shaking his head. "That is not justice. That is cruelty wrapped in bureaucracy." He walked back toward his table, his voice steady. "You have a choice," he said, looking each juror in the eye. "You can enforce a law that punishes a man for trying to survive. Or you can send a message that America is better than this. That we are not a country of blind, unthinking laws. That we are a country of people. And people deserve compassion." He let the words hang in the air before nodding. "I trust you to make the right choice." With that, he returned to his seat. Judge Horowitz cleared his throat. "The jury will now deliberate." The room buzzed as the jury was led into the deliberation room. The waiting began. Bondi sat still, her fingers laced together. She had presented the law, the logic. But would it be enough? Vega sat back, exhaling slowly. He had given them the truth. But would they listen? The minutes crawled by. An hour passed. Then 2. Then, at last, the jury returned. The bailiff took a slip of paper from the foreman and handed it to the judge. Judge Horowitz scanned the verdict before nodding, his expression unreadable. He looked up. "In the case of the state of Florida versus the city of Miami, regarding the enforcement of Florida's anti-sanctuary law, the jury finds in favor of." The courtroom held its breath.